I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air, but in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard.
If you truly want to understand just how racist the USDA has been for generations towards black farmers, well, if you were to read the first paragraph in this report, there's actually a sentence and there's a term there that I've highlighted. And yes, folks, that is true. Black farmers have called the USDA the last plantation. This is in a federal document, which means for generations, black farmers have called the USDA that term. And this document is from 2001. This is the 2000s, which means the federal government or members of the federal government went out and talked to black farmers, and that's what they told them in the 2000s. And yet you have USDA employees who are sitting there playing stupid like they don't understand that what I told them on the phone they have heard before, except the last time they heard it in federal court. In the mythos of the United States of America, there is this image of the American farmer as the backbone of the American spirit when you look at what they produce. With their many crops of produce, with them producing cattle and also producing our beef from the cattle. You have chicken farmers who produce our eggs and our poultry. You have your sheep herders who provide the wool for our clothing and other products. Hey, you even have hog farmers who provide all of our pork. And these professions are seen as noble because they not only provide a valuable resource, but the American farmer is seen as hardworking, diligent, and patriotic. However, some groups in this country have experienced discrimination, while others were given a leg up. And if you don't know what I mean by that, well, there was once a civil rights activist who pointed out exactly what I just said. And now I want you to listen to him, and you may have heard of him.
America refused to give the Negro any land. Through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges, government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. We're coming to get our check.
My name is Tim Pigford, and I'm the named plaintiff in the lawsuit Pigford v. Glickman, which was filed on behalf of African American farmers. And we are one of the 4 minority groups that are asking for justice for Hispanic farmers, Native American farmers, and female farmers, that they may receive justice as we have.
If you want to understand the history of racism as it pertains to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, well, you must understand the history of how this agency has treated black farmers. There are very few court cases that perfectly demonstrate this better than Pigford v. Glickman. And that was a class action lawsuit between black farmers and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA. And spoiler alert, the USDA lost really badly. And now you might be saying, well, there was a settlement, but in that case, it was proven that this federal agency openly discriminated against black farmers who tried to apply for loans. And even when those farmers would complain, the bigwigs at the USDA would either not respond or fail to investigate. And even when they did, it was usually a case of, we've investigated ourselves and found that ourselves have done nothing wrong. This was proven to have occurred between 1983 until 1997, or at least according to the paperwork. And now you might be thinking to yourself, why didn't these black farmers go above the USDA and contact their local representatives? Because their local reps and also their reps in Washington and also their senators are supposed to work for them. Well, the problem with these black farmers actually trying to reach out to Washington for help is that many of the senators and also the congressmen at the time were racist and were using dog whistles in order to discredit the black farmers who were the claimants in this case. Like, for example, here's a clip from MSNBC from 13 years ago featuring former Republican Iowa Representative Steve King, who was known to make some racist comments.
Iowa Republican Congressman Steve King will not have any committee assignments during the congressional term underway in Washington. The House Republican Steering Committee made that unanimous decision tonight. The Iowan will not hold his previous seat on the prestigious Judiciary Committee or the Ag Committee, a key one for his state. The congressman's been in the spotlight since the New York Times quoted him saying that he doesn't understand why terms like white nationalist and white supremacist are offensive. According to the Washington Post, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said, quote, "If he doesn't understand why white supremacy is offensive, then he should find another line of work," end quote. Congressman King says his comments have been completely mischaracterized and that he rejects white supremacy.
But the comments that he made towards black farmers is quite interesting.
The fraudulent claims might be, well, Johnny, yeah, he was raised on a farm, but he wouldn't help his daddy. He went off to the city and became a drug addict, and when his daddy needed the help, Johnny wouldn't come and help his daddy. But now his daddy's died, and Johnny wants the $50,000 that comes from the USDA under this claim.
This man suggested that the black litigants, or the black farmers in this case, were nothing more than city-dwelling drug addicts. And he said this with no evidence and without presenting a single receipt. And so on April 14th of 1999, federal judge Paul L. Friedman approved both a consent decree and also a settlement agreement in the Pigford case. There was supposed to be $1.06 billion in cash payments, tax payments, and also debt relief. And now you might be thinking, well, surely that was the end of it, right? But it turns out that through some political finagling and also the USDA intentionally putting roadblocks in place to make sure that money never went out to black farmers.
This case involving black farmers who said they were discriminated against because they couldn't get loans from the federal government has taken a couple of decades to get settled. Why so long?
I can't speak to the first 18 years. The last 2 years we've been working hard to get Congress to approve the appropriation. This was reopened by the 2008 Farm Bill, and we've been focused on making sure that the congressional appropriation, which was a condition of the 2008 Farm Bill, was met. And the Senate passed the bill last week, and we hope the House does very soon, and then we can get on to getting the resources out to farmers.
Hundreds of black farmers in Alabama and across the country meeting today to get what they say they are owed.
The promise of aid that fails to materialize is all too familiar to many farmers of color, long subjected to discrimination in government programs.
New this month, farmers can apply for a share of more than $2.2 billion in grant money from the federal government.
It addresses discrimination in how USDA farm subsidies were given out before 2021.
And so while researching this video, I decided to go and apply for a USDA loan myself because I was genuinely interested, and also I wanted to see if my experience was going to match my predecessors or my ancestors who came before me. And I am sad to report that I can see why so many black farmers decided to sue the USDA, because from beginning to end, it was almost like they were upset that I even applied. And I also spoke to a farm loan manager whose name is Scott Neiman. And when Scott Neiman spoke to me, he told me that I believed a lot of misinformation about the USDA in terms of generational racism and it matching the experience that many people who came before me had. But the problem with Scott Neiman's lying claims is the same problem that Scott Neiman had with the Iowa Dispatch. When I quoted their article on the phone to him and told him that yes, this whole lawsuit and the payouts that we're seeing currently in the modern day is linked all the way way to a case back in the 90s and cases before that, because the only reason why there was a 2021 appropriations bill that was a part of the Inflation Reduction Act that was supposed to get some money out to black farmers is due to the USDA's racism for generations. And let me show you the reasons why Scott Neiman did not like the USDA being torn apart by the Iowa Dispatch, and you'll see the history of racism with this federal agency, which at this point might as well be wearing some white hoods. Here is a timeline of black farmers versus the USDA from 1920 up until the present day. And so in 1920, the USDA said that 14% of all US farmers were black, and that number was 923,708. In 1933, the New Deal legislation to address low crop prices by reducing acres of farmland displaces many black farmers. And so that was the federal government doing something that negatively impacted black farmers, which makes the US government liable. In 1964, the share of black farm operators falls to 5.8%. And so if you go back to 1920 and compare it to 1964, which is 44 years later, the percentage of black farmers goes from 14% to 5.8%. That is significant. In 1965, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights finds the USDA discriminated against black farmers when providing loans and conservation payments. And so if you're wondering, how did all of these farmers suddenly lose their farms? Well, several things. There were sundown towns, there was white supremacy, there was the Klan, and there were white people who would intentionally sabotage black farm owners in order to ruin their farms. And then you had the double whammy of the USDA refusing to give out loans to black farmers and even conservation payments. And if you're wondering what we mean by conservation payments, well, that's linked to what MLK was talking about. When you have white farmers who were given a bunch of land, and then when they don't use that land, they are then given subsidies and even payments by the federal government because they didn't use that land.
Many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps.
And so when people mention terms like white privilege, and when you learn that this land was given specifically to white people over black people, and some of that farmland was stolen from black people and given to white people, and then those same white people in further generations are being paid to not farm that land, well, then you can no longer ask the question, what is white privilege? Because if that's not privilege, then I want to know, what is your definition of privilege? In 1968, the Commission on Civil Rights finds black farmers continue to face discrimination when seeking farm loans and assistance. And so what you're seeing there is more of the same. The Commission on Civil Rights came as a response to discrimination that black people were facing. And when they found that discrimination, not only was nothing done about it, that discrimination would only continue. In 1970, the Commission on Civil Rights finds, quote, discrimination persists in the operation of some agricultural programs, end quote, noting that, quote, there are also no civil rights staff in the USDA field offices, end quote. And that is significant because at one point the USDA had an Office of Civil Rights because it was discovered that the USDA was incredibly racist, and as a response to this, there was an Office of Civil Rights within the USDA that was supposed to make sure that claims of discrimination was being heard. But as you're seeing here, there was no civil rights staff in the USDA Office of Civil Rights. In 1981, the USDA itself said in a report that black and minority farmers are, quote, disproportionately represented in poverty groups, end quote, and that these types of farms have less access to needed credit. And they said this without any self-awareness because the agency who's supposed to look out for farmers just so happens to be the USDA. Because how in the world can you be the U.S. Department of Agriculture if you're not helping the people producing said agriculture? And then in 1982, black farm operators fell to just 2% of all farm operations in the United States. And the Commission on Civil Rights once again noted that discrimination led to the decline of black farmers, and much of that discrimination was coming from the USDA. In 1983, the Reagan administration dismantled the USDA Office of Civil Rights, which means that the office that wasn't even staffed in the first place was now being dismantled. And what what is significant about that is that in the original Pigford case on April 14th of 1999, it was proven that the USDA discriminated against black farmers based on race and failed to investigate or properly respond to complaints from 1983 until 1997. And 1983 is the same year that once again Ronald Reagan shut down the Office of Civil Rights within the USDA. You know, the same office that wasn't doing anything in the first place because that office had no staff. And then in 1990, you know, when people think that racism was just over, you know, slavery was done, the civil rights era was done, and we just solved racism. Well, it turns out the USDA wanted to continue the American tradition all the way into the 1990s. Because in 1990, a U.S. House Committee on Government Operations did a report, and in that report, we find that there was rampant discrimination coming from the USDA loan programs. And so I was born in 1986, which means that within my lifetime, black Americans just like me were subjected to racism from the USDA. And people like Scott Neiman have the nerve and the audacity to pretend like these settlements and all these lawsuits, even the ones in the modern day, are not linked to generational racism when we can see the generational racism right on the screen before us. It's almost as if this guy doesn't realize that the internet exists and that people can actually check your claims. And check this, in 1993, there was an independent report from a consulting group known as Westover Consultants, and they found that the USDA was not being held accountable for civil rights violations. Even if a USDA employee were to report claims of racism or sexism or any other form of bigotry, either nothing was done about it or that employee was retaliated against. And Westover Consultants made sure to not just get claims from black farmers or farmers of color or women farmers. They got some of this information directly from USDA employees. And so when you have an independent consulting firm who confirms exactly what black farmers have been saying for generations up until that point, then I think that you know this only gets worse. And so in August of 1994, the USDA kind of knew they were going to face some class action lawsuits from black farmers because they knew they were a little bit racist. And so how racist is the USDA? What would they do to try to deny justice to all of these black farmers? Well, they tried to argue that they did not have the authority to compensate black farmers who were suing them left and right. And so basically they were arguing, yes, we understand that we weren't giving black farmers loans, but now that we've done that, right, we are now going to deny them compensation even if a federal judge says we have to compensate them. And so this came years before the Pigford decision, or even when Pigford was filed, because Pigford was filed in August of 1997 under class action status. And so the USDA said, hey, we got a way of getting out of compensating black farmers. Well, not so fast, USDA, because on April 18th of 1994, the then U.S. Assistant Attorney General Walter Dellinger filed a memo detailing USDA's authority to award monetary relief to black farmers. And so basically that was the USAG's office saying, yeah, if you harm people and it is proven in federal court, you can't just skate out of paying people because that would only continue the racism that all of those people are already suing you over. So we're not gonna help you continue your racism. I mean, just think to yourself, imagine for a second, you walk into a courtroom and you tell a judge, yeah, I know these people are gonna sue me later on, but hey, listen, we don't have the authority to compensate these people. Think about that in your head. I want you to imagine that you are the judge and you're hearing this. And with just that one example, you now understand why the USDA keeps getting destroyed in federal courts, because federal judges just don't put up with these kind of shenanigans. I'm just saying. And yet another federal agency called the USDA essentially racist in 1995. And that was the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or GAO, that found that the USDA failed to address racial discrimination, and also they found widespread underrepresentation of minority farmers on county USDA committees. So basically, not only did the USDA want just white people having farmland, but even when it comes to the leadership decisions, they only wanted white people. And in 1996, yet another consultant, this time DJ Miller, in a report found that black farmers were not getting a fair share of the disaster payments, loans, or subsidies as compared to their white counterparts, and the National Black Farmers Association held a demonstration outside of the White House. And now I want to pause there at the video because that is very important, because the National Black Farmers Association was founded and is headed by a man named John Boyd Jr. And John Boyd Jr. will become famous in many of these demonstrations because he was known to bring protest wagons and tractors all the way over to DC. And there was one time that he actually brought a mule to symbolize 40 acres and a mule. So when it comes to black empowerment for black farmers, there are very few people in American history who are more important and more pivotal than John Boyd Jr. And there's also something else special about this man, and it's that he lives rent-free in the head of Steve King. Even though Steve King is no longer a U.S. rep, Steve King has been tweeting about John Boyd Jr. constantly, which is significant because the U.S. is the third most populated country on planet Earth. And so if you picked one person out of the third most populated country on Earth to tweet about even after you're out of office, that is the very definition of rent-free. And it's not hard to see why Steve King and other suspected white supremacists don't like John Boyd Jr. because he's known to call out white supremacy. And the best part about it is that this man has land and he has money, so he doesn't have to take up this fight. He is fighting this fight on behalf of all black farmers, because it is very easy to fight when you have nothing to lose, because many people in John Boyd Jr.'s position who already have theirs usually have a disposition of, well, I got mine, so you better go and get yours. But John Boyd Jr. did not think like that, because he wants all black farmers to be treated fairly. Not better than white farmers, but just fairly. And boy, 1997 was a busy year for the USDA's white supremacy. First off, due to all of the discrimination and racism from the USDA, the share of black farm operators fell from 14% in 1920 all the way down to 0.9% in 1997. And then the USDA's Inspector General accused the USDA, his own agency, of a quote climate of disorder end quote among civil rights staff. And then the GAO again reported on the Farm Service Agency part of the USDA suffering from some racism because there was a lack of diversity, and that's gonna come into play a little bit later. Just you wait and see. And then in 97, also the Congressional Black Caucus held its first ever forum on discrimination against black farmers, and specifically with the USDA. And then you have the Pigford v. Glickman lawsuit that was filed in federal court under class action status. And then the USDA itself put out a report from the Civil Rights Action Team that documented a long and detailed history of racism, anti-black hatred, and racial bias from the USDA. So the agency itself is calling itself racist. And if you're questioning this even for a second, well, in 1998, the USDA yet again reported their role in the fall in percentage of black farm operators, which means they are admitting that their own racism that was generational played a role in decreasing the amount of black farm operators, which also means that Scott Neiman and other USDA employees who were just lying through their teeth need to read the history of their own agency, who admitted multiple times that they were racist. And so in 1999, John Boyd Jr. famously showed up to Washington, D.C. with his mule. And here's a picture of that scene. It is amazing. I don't care who you are. When it comes to protesting, I think that we should all utilize more livestock animals, because John Boyd Jr. standing up for his rights and also the rights of black farmers with this form of protest, it really did catch some eyes because it's kind of hard to ignore. And also in 1999, you had the Pigford v. USDA or Glickman settlement. and that was to once again pay out black farmers $1.03 billion. And more than 22,000 black farmers sought claims, but only around 15,645 received payments that, let's just say, weren't exactly sufficient. And when it came to late claims, more than 61,000 black farmers filed those claims, but less than 2,600 actually were accepted. But the fact that you've had thousands of farmers receive payments at all, well, that's a demonstration of, once again, generational racism. In the year 2000, the Senate Agriculture Committee held a hearing about the discrimination against black farmers and mostly about the USDA. And you would think that with the Pigford v. Glickman lawsuit and the settlement, that the USDA would clean up their act. But in 2001, we find that the Commission on Civil Rights flat out said that black farmers wait on average 4 times longer than white farmers for farm loans from the USDA. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, why didn't these black farmers complain? Because others did and they got a huge settlement. Granted, the payments were terrible and not all eligible black farmers were paid out, but they got something, right? Well, also in 2001, we find out that the USDA received more than 14,000 discrimination complaints that were filed between 2001 and 2008. But somehow, some way, the USDA found that only one of those 14,000 complaints had any merit. And if you truly want to understand just how racist the USDA has been for generations towards black farmers, well, if you were to read the first paragraph in this report, the report that we just went over, there's actually a sentence and there's a term there that I've highlighted. And yes, folks, that is true. Black farmers have called the USDA the last plantation. This is in a federal document, which means for generations, black farmers have called the USDA that term. And this document is from 2001. This is the 2000s, which means the federal government or members of the federal government went out and talked to black farmers, and that's what they told them in the 2000s. And yet you have USDA employees who are sitting there playing stupid like they don't understand that what I told them on the phone they have heard before, except the last time they heard it in federal court. In 2002, you saw the same racism and the same biases, because while white farmers received $8.9 billion in farm subsidies, black farmers, on the other hand, received just $21.2 million. And so if you remember back in 1994 when we discussed the then U.S. Assistant Attorney General Walter Dellinger explaining to the USDA that they had the authority to award monetary relief to black farmers, well, that was the USDA trying to avoid accountability by saying that they don't have the authority to pay out black farmers. And the reason why I wanted to remind you of that is because that is the context for 2004 when the Environmental Working Group, or EWG, and the National Black Farmers Association performed an investigation into the USDA into the year of 1999 with the Pigford settlement. And so they found that the USDA willfully obstructed justice by trying to undermine the terms of the Pigford v. Glickman settlement. And if you want to know the effects of that, well, the vast majority of black farmers were denied compensation. And when we say vast majority, we're talking about over 81,000 black farmers who could have filed claims, and the court said that those payments should have been automatic to anyone who was a black farmer and who was subjected to racism and or denied a loan on the basis of race. But the 81,000 black farmers who were denied their money have no future opportunity to get that money, which means that the USDA intentionally tried to put in roadblocks to prevent payments to go out and also disqualify black farmers who were clearly qualified to receive compensation due to the USDA's racism. And so justice was denied to all of those black farmers who were all tax-paying American citizens who did nothing wrong and just wanted to be treated fairly. But that was far too much for the USDA. Do you remember that Office of Civil Rights within the USDA? Well, it turns out that the GAO reported in 2008 that they failed to address civil rights claims and also claims of discrimination. And in the same year, the U.S. House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform held a hearing on discrimination by the USDA. And 2008 is a big year for another reason, and that is because the U.S. Congress allowed black farmers who were originally denied payments from the Pigford settlement to reopen their claims, which means that the USDA thought that they had just skated by without compensating those black farmers. And the craziest part about this is that that money would have came from US taxpayers, and it wouldn't have come from the USDA employees themselves. So why then would they decide to try to block up those payments is beyond me, but it is strange that these USDA employees were so racist that not only would they deny these black farmers their rightful just due, but they were acting like all of the money was personally coming from them. The next part is quite amazing, so pay attention. Do you remember back in 2001 when we discussed the fact that the USDA received more than 14,000 discrimination complaints, but somehow they found that only one of those complaints had merit? Well, we find out that just 8 years later, the USDA reopened the discrimination cases and found that 3,800 of the 14,000 actually did have merit, but the statute of limitations had expired. So only 760 cases were addressed, and that means that the USDA lied about all of those discrimination complaints having no merit, and they intentionally dragged things out so that the statute of limitations would pass by and expire. So in other words, not only were these people racist, but they were intentionally so, and they dragged things out just so they wouldn't have to look at themselves in the mirror as they're wearing white sheets. In 2010, our hero, John Boyd Jr., drove a tractor around Washington, D.C. in order to meet with U.S. lawmakers because he wanted more funding for USDA discrimination cases that were either in court or were coming to court very soon. Also in 2010, my home state of South Carolina ruled against the USDA in favor of black farmers who face discrimination. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, there was a lot of discrimination in South Carolina from the USDA directed towards black farmers. And then the USDA Office of Civil Rights wanted to extend the statute of limitation for discrimination complaints, but the US Congress, for whatever reason, went against that. But Congress did allow another $1.25 billion in payments that were linked to the Pigford settlement. And that was for all of the black farmers who were denied payments due to the USDA intentionally trying to make sure that none of those black farmers got any money. And now the next part is also very important because in 2011, we are reminded that in the Pigford case, there wasn't just a monetary settlement, there was also a consent decree. And if you don't know what that is, a federal consent decree is an agreement that is established with a federal judge, and sometimes it can happen with police departments, sheriff's departments, or in this case, the USDA. And it is a federal agreement that allows for a monitor or a guarantee that a government or federal agency is actually in compliance with the law. And the reason why I wanted to point that out is because with federal consent decrees, you have what you call a monitor or someone who watches to make sure that everything is on the up and up. And the Pigford cases monitor reported that the USDA failed to provide debt relief to black farmers, which means that even after the settlement, even after we are in 2011, we are in the 2010s, folks, and the USDA is still racist and are in active defiance of a federal consent decree, which means that they were ignoring the order of a federal judge. In 2012, the disparity between funding for white farmers versus black farmers only continued because in 2012, white farmers received about $8.1 billion in farm subsidies, while black farmers received about $64 million, which, if you know math, appears to be a little bit of a disparity. And now for the next part in 2014, I want you to pay attention to these numbers. In 1920, 14% of all U.S. farmers were black farm operators. And then the share of black farmers fell to about 5.8% in 1964. And then in 1982, the share of black farm operators fell to about 2%. In 1997, it fell to 0.9%. And then the USDA claims that the share of black farm operators rose by 1.3%. But that's only after all the lawsuits and all the money that was paid out. And then in 2007, they say that the share of black farm operators rose by 1.3% again. And then in 2014, the USDA reported a 9% increase in the number of black farm operators. But in 2016, the share of USDA lending to black farmers fell to 0.8%. So the moment they noticed any kind of increase, they said, oh no, we can't have this. We can't have any black farmers actually growing our food and giving us the wool or helping this country. Oh no, no, no. We must discriminate immediately, because as numerous attorney generals, 4 different presidents, several members of Congress, several senators, and many people involved in the federal government, even the USDA itself has admitted to, black farms are threatened by the racism from the USDA. And so there is definitely a correlation between the fall of black farm operators and USDA racism. Because if you know you have a problem with racism and anti-blackness from your agency, then why in the world in 2016 would you have an issue with the USDA lending to black farmers versus white farmers if your goal is to get more black farmers out there? And wouldn't you know it, in 2017, the USDA reported that the share of black farm operators remained at 1.7%, which means that the share of black farm operators did not increase. And we know from the previous year, in 2016, the USDA had an issue with lending out money to black farmers versus white farmers. And to drive that point home, we also find out that in 2017, black farmers were once again shafted out of money because they received about $59.4 million in farm subsidies, while their white farmer counterparts received about $9.7 billion. And the reason why I wanted to go over the numbers of black farmers over the years in terms of the rise and the fall of the percentage is because I wanted to point that out as the context for 2019, because legal experts found that the USDA has overstated or over-exaggerated, inflated the numbers of black farmers. Because if they inflate the numbers, then it makes them look good, because historically speaking, everyone knows the USDA has been so racist towards black farmers that it has caused the fall of black farmers in terms of numbers. And so by them overcounting the number of black farmers, they can now say, well, we've done better. Here's an actual improvement. Here's some numbers. When the fact is they were just capping. And if you want to see even more evidence of this, well, in 2019, the GAO reported that black and minority farmers are still having challenges when seeking agricultural loans from the USDA. And mind you, folks, that is 2019. That is only 5 years ago, which means that the same racism that you saw all the way back in the early 1900s from the USDA and even before that, we are now seeing in the modern day, and you can't just ignore that. That is significant. That is in your lifetime. That is happening right now. Also in 2019, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren released a detailed plan to address discrimination faced by black farmers that happened both in the past and also in the present day. And then as a response to this, numerous black farmers and advocates in 2019 sent recommendations to Senator Warren. And then in 2020, during the height of racial justice protests, New Jersey Democratic Senator Cory Booker, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and New York Democrat Senator Kirsten Gillibrand introduced the Justice for Black Farmers Act, and this bill will be justified in 2021 when the GAO found that black and minority farmers once again have less access to credit than white farmers. And that's also why in 2021, Democrat Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia introduced a bill to provide debt relief to black and minority farmers. And as you saw with all of those U.S. senators, they were citing the Pigford case and other points of historical racism for all of the bills that you've been seeing lately that are aimed towards helping black farmers recover from the USDA's historical racism. And so I brought that up to remind Mr. Scott Neiman and other USDA employees that when you talk to members of the general public on the phone, it pays to not lie, because all you gotta do is know about Greg A. Francis, who was the lead counsel in the Pigford case, and all you gotta do is read his book, which is called Just Harvest, the story of how black farmers won the largest civil rights case against the U.S. government. And yes, that's true. At that time, the Pigford case was the largest civil rights discrimination settlement in U.S. history. And the man who calls this as the lead counsel is a black man named Greg Francis, who is one of the best lawyers in American history, because you gotta really know your stuff to take on the U.S. government and win. And so let's go through the timeline of of the Pigford case. And once again, what you're seeing with the Pigford case is Timothy Pigford, who filed a federal lawsuit against the USDA and the person who was the then Secretary of Agriculture, whose name was Dan Glickman. And we know the outcome of that case.
My name is Tim Pigford, and I'm the named plaintiff in the lawsuit Pigford v. Glickman, which was filed on behalf of African-American farmers. And we are one of the 4 minority groups that are asking for justice for Hispanic farmers, Native American farmers, and female farmers, that they may receive justice as we have received in the Pigford case in terms of having their cases settled in a class-wide action. I have written a letter to President Obama asking that he close the book on this issue of discrimination at USDA, and that he asks the Department of Justice and USDA to negotiate in a fair and meaningful manner with the representatives of with the Hispanic farmers and the Native American farmers and the female farmers, and that he truly close this book and end the corridor of shame that has been placed upon these 4 minority groups ever since 1935.
Historical racism was proven on behalf of the USDA. And then we move forward to August 14th of 1999, where the case was settled. And everybody was supposed to get an automatic payment of at least $50,000. And as it says here, $50,000 just isn't enough to help someone get their farm back when they've been subjected to government racism. 2003, Pigford 2 is filed, and all the black farmers who weren't allowed to file their cases in the original Pigford case are now allowed to file. September 2011, you get more legal problems for the USDA from several law firms around the country, and that includes lawyer Greg Francis. And then you have November of 2011 into May of 2012, where you have at least 40,000 claim forms that were submitted, with less than 33,000 that were completed and filed on time. And then in 2014, there was a surplus of money that was left over after the Pigford 2 claims were all paid out. And that money is being held in case anyone else brings a lawsuit against the USDA for historical racism. And in the present day, the same law firms, including lawyer Greg Francis, is still fighting for the rights of black farmers. And so I want to quote USDA employee and farm loan manager Scott Neiman when he told me on the phone, quote, "I would like to think that we've gotten better," end quote. Well, sir, if you've gotten better, then why in the hell do I have so much evidence that points in the opposite direction?
ACAB, don't you step to ME. I run to your sundown towns, then turn them upside down. But some of y'all monsters like Stranger Things in the upside down. No surrender, no retreat, certified soldier. Got receipts, you can't walk with my feet. I pack nothing but steel for the heat. I'm not soft, I'm elite. Play my anthem on repeat, now sing it with me. ACAB, hating is just weak. Get off my meat, go take a seat. Came from nothing, now I'm something. Descendant of slaves, enemy slave. It's just how I was raised. Black power, temperature raised. Beautiful yet bloody days. That's why I can't be tamed. None of it was ever a game. ACAB, don't step to me. Ancestral power through me. Big dog, big man, big money. Now feel the teeth.